You think modern sewage workers have it bad? Think again. Tonight, while you flush your toilet without a second thought, I'm going to take you back to a time when dealing with human waste wasn't just unpleasant work. It was literally signing your own death certificate. Medieval cesspit cleaners, or gong farmers as they were mockingly called, didn't just clean shit. They descended into the bowels of hell itself, armed with nothing but wooden scoops in the desperate hope they'd see another sunrise. And when I'm done telling you their story, you'll never look at your bathroom the same way again. Picture this: London, 1326. The sun hasn't even kissed the horizon when Thomas the gong farmer wakes up in his hovel near the Thames. His wife turns away from his morning kiss, not out of marital discord, but because the smell of death and decay has become so embedded in his skin that soap can't touch it anymore. Thomas knows something his neighbors don't. Today might be his last day breathing, not because of war, not because of plague, but because he's about to climb down into a cesspit that's been fermenting human excrement for months, maybe years. You see, medieval cities weren't designed for human waste. They just accumulated it. Imagine every apartment building, every castle, every monastery, just letting their shit pile up in underground chambers until someone desperate enough, someone with no other choice, would agree to go down there and shovel it out. These weren't just holes in the ground. These were toxic chambers filled with methane gas so concentrated it could knock a man unconscious in seconds. Hydrogen sulfide so potent it would burn your lungs from the inside out. And Thomas? He's about to lower himself into that chemical soup with nothing but a wooden ladder and a prayer. The city authorities didn't give a damn about worker safety. Why would they? Gong farmers were society's bottom feeders, literally. They were the men so poor, so desperate, that they'd risk their lives for a few coins. The irony? The very people who kept the city from drowning in its own filth were treated like the filth themselves. They could only work at night, not out of consideration, but because the sight and smell of them would disturb the decent folk during daylight hours. Here's what the history books won't tell you. Every single gong farmer knew he was living on borrowed time. The job wasn't about if you'd die, but when and how spectacularly. Would you suffocate from methane poisoning, your lungs filling with invisible death as you scraped centuries of human waste? Would you slip and drown in a pool of liquefied excrement, your last breath a mouthful of humanity's collective shame? Or would you be one of the lucky ones who'd simply collapse from the toxic fumes and die quickly before your body could register the full horror of your situation? The medieval authorities had a solution for the growing problem of cesspit cleaners dying. On the job, find more poor people. Simple, effective, utterly inhuman. They'd sweep through the poorest districts of London, offering what seemed like decent money to men who hadn't eaten in days. What they didn't mention was that this money was essentially payment for a suicide mission. The life expectancy of a gong farmer wasn't measured in years or even months. It was measured in jobs completed. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Some men became addicted to the work, not because they enjoyed it, that would be impossible, but because the pay was better than anything else available to them. They'd develop what we might now recognize as a form of Stockholm syndrome with their own mortality. They knew each job could be their last, but the alternative was watching their families starve. So they'd descend into those pits again and again, each time rolling the dice with death, each time coming up just a little more poisoned than before. The medieval records are surprisingly detailed about gong farmer deaths, probably because their bodies created such a public health hazard. When a gong farmer died in a cesspit, his corpse didn't just decompose, it became part of the toxic soup that would eventually poison the next poor soul who descended into that hole. Some pits became graveyards, layers of human remains mixed with centuries of waste, creating an archaeological horror that defied comprehension. And the smell? Imagine every public restroom you've ever avoided, multiply that by 1,000, then seal it in an underground chamber for months. Now imagine that's your office. The hydrogen sulfide would permanently damage their sense of smell if they lived long enough to develop tolerance. Most didn't. The lucky ones would lose consciousness quickly when the gas levels spiked. The unlucky ones would remain aware as their nervous systems shut down piece by piece while they drowned in humanity's collective refuse. The tools they used were almost insultingly primitive. Wooden scoops, rope buckets, and ladders that were often rotted from the toxic environment. No masks, no ventilation systems, no safety protocols. Just a man, his tools, and a hole full of death waiting to claim him. The wooden scoops would absorb the toxic chemicals and literally dissolve in their hands over time. The ropes would rot and snap, sending men plummeting into pits from which their bodies might never be recovered. What's most chilling is how normalized this death sentence became. Medieval society simply accepted that some jobs required human sacrifice. They didn't call it that, of course. They called it honest work, but everyone knew the score. When a gong farmer's widow remarried within weeks of his death, nobody questioned it. When children refused to follow in their father's footsteps, even while starving, nobody blamed them. The job was understood to be a form of slow-motion suicide that paid just well enough to keep desperate men volunteering for it. But this nightmare didn't exist in isolation. The death of gong farmers created a ripple effect of horror that touched every level of medieval society. When they died, Their families didn't just lose breadwinners, they inherited the social stigma of their profession. Children of the dead gong farmers were marked for life, their only career prospects being the same toxic pits that killed their fathers. Now let me show you exactly how they died. Because understanding the mechanics of their death reveals something far more sinister about medieval society than simple neglect. It reveals deliberate indifference to human suffering when that suffering served a purpose. The first killer wasn't the smell or even the obvious toxins. It was something invisible, something that would creep into their lungs before they even realized they were in danger. Methane gas. Picture this. You're climbing down a rickety wooden ladder into a pit that's been sealed for months. The waste has been fermenting, creating a cocktail of gases that would make a modern hazmat team retreat immediately. But our gong farmer doesn't know about gas concentrations or oxygen displacement. All he knows is that the air suddenly feels thick, almost solid, and then his vision starts to blur. Methane doesn't just suffocate you. It displaces the oxygen so gradually that your brain doesn't register the danger until it's too late. Your body starts shutting down systems, beginning with higher cognitive functions. You become euphoric, almost drunk, as your brain begins to starve. Many gong farmers probably died with smiles on their faces, thinking they'd found some strange paradise at the bottom of hell. Their last thoughts weren't of terror, but of bizarre, oxygen-deprived hallucinations, as their nervous systems flickered out like candles in an airless room. But methane was merciful compared to hydrogen sulfide, the gas that gave these pits their distinctive rotten egg smell, amplified to weaponized levels. Here's what the medical records from medieval monasteries tell us, written by monks who had to treat the few survivors. Hydrogen sulfide attacks your nervous system like acid poured directly onto exposed nerves. It doesn't just damage tissue, it destroys the very pathways that allow your brain to control your body. The monks describe symptoms that sound like demonic possession. Violent convulsions, temporary blindness, paralysis that would come and go in waves. Men who survived a day in the pits would sometimes lose the ability to speak for weeks afterward, their vocal cords chemically burned from the inside. Others would develop what they called gong farmer's dance, uncontrollable tremors that would persist for months, assuming they lived that long. Their nervous systems had been so thoroughly poisoned that their bodies couldn't remember how to be still. What's particularly horrifying is that the medieval authorities knew about these symptoms. They had to. The evidence was stumbling around their streets, begging for alms. But instead of improving working conditions, they did something far more cynical. They created a category of acceptable losses and factored gong farmer deaths into their city planning. The mathematics of human disposal, quite literally. The actual process of cleaning a cesspit was a masterclass in how to die slowly while pretending to work. First, they'd remove the covering stones, usually at night, because the initial release of gases would be visible as a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Experienced gong farmers knew this was the moment of maximum danger. The gases that had been trapped were now free to expand, and anyone standing too close would get a face full of concentrated death. Smart gong farmers, the ones who lasted more than a few jobs, developed rudimentary safety protocols that sound pathetic by modern standards, but were revolutionary for their time. They'd lower burning candles into the pit before descending. If the candle went out, they knew oxygen levels were too low to support human life. If the candle flared up, they knew methane concentrations were high enough to cause an explosion. Either way, a dead candle meant they should wait. Problem was, waiting meant no pay, and no pay meant no food, so they'd compromise with death. They'd wait just long enough for the most dangerous gases to dissipate, then descend into what was still a toxic environment, gambling that they could work fast enough to get out before the poison accumulated in their systems. It was Russian roulette with chemistry, and the house always won eventually. The tools they used tell their own story of desperation and ingenuity. The wooden scoops weren't just tools, they were early warning systems. Experienced gong farmers would lick their scoops before entering a pit. If the wood tasted bitter or metallic, they knew acid levels were high enough to dissolve flesh. If the wood felt slimy, even after being dried, they knew anaerobic bacteria had reached concentrations that could cause infections that would literally rot them alive from the inside out. They'd fashioned primitive masks from cloth soaked in wine or vinegar, not because they understood germ theory, but because they'd noticed that strong smells seemed to provide some protection against the worst effects of pit gases. What they didn't realize was that the alcohol was actually providing minimal antiseptic protection, and the strong smell was masking their body's natural warning signals. They were essentially numbing themselves to danger while exposing themselves to it. The most successful gong farmers developed what we might now recognize as occupational dissociation. They'd trained themselves to work in an almost trance-like state, moving through the cleaning process without fully engaging their conscious minds. This wasn't just psychological protection, it was survival strategy. Full awareness of their situation would have triggered panic responses that could prove fatal in such a toxic environment. But even the most experienced gong farmers couldn't escape the cumulative effects of their profession. Their bodies became living laboratories for the slow-motion effects of chemical poisoning. Their hair would fall out in patches, not from age, but from follicle damage caused by hydrogen sulfide exposure. Their fingernails would turn black and eventually fall off, as their extremities suffered permanent circulation damage. Their teeth would loosen and drop out as the acid environment destroyed the calcium in their bones. Perhaps most disturbing was how they'd age. A gong farmer who'd been working for 2 years would look like a man 20 years older. Their skin would take on a grayish, waxy appearance that no amount of washing could improve. Their eyes would develop a permanent yellowish tint from liver damage. They'd walk with the careful, measured steps of old men, not because of joint problems, but because their nervous systems could no longer be trusted to coordinate complex movements. The medieval guild system, which provided some protection for most craftsmen, explicitly excluded gong farmers. They couldn't organize, couldn't demand better conditions, couldn't even legally congregate in groups larger than 3, ostensibly to prevent the spread of disease, but really to prevent them from realizing their collective power. They were kept isolated, desperate, and expendable by design, yet some of them tried to fight back, in small, pathetic ways that reveal both their humanity and their desperation. They'd mark dangerous pits with small stones arranged in patterns that other gong farmers would recognize as warnings. They'd share information about which areas of the city had pits with better ventilation. They'd even develop crude first aid techniques for treating gas poisoning, mostly involving forced vomiting and crude bloodletting that probably did more harm than good, but represented their desperate attempts to save each other. The most heartbreaking part? Some gong farmers developed a form of professional pride. They'd compete over who could clean a pit fastest, who could work in the most dangerous conditions, who could survive the longest in the trade. It wasn't bravado. It was the human mind's desperate attempt to find meaning in meaningless suffering. They created a hierarchy of honor in a profession that society considered beneath contempt. But this culture of grim professionalism masked a terrible truth. Every gong farmer knew he was training his replacement. When they took on apprentices, usually their own sons or desperate relatives, they weren't teaching a trade, they were passing on a death sentence. And they knew it. The experienced ones would sometimes refuse to train newcomers, not out of selfishness, but out of a twisted form of mercy. This brings us to the most chilling aspect of medieval cesspit cleaning. It became a form of societal pressure valve. When unemployment rose, when harvest failed, when economic conditions pushed more people into desperation, the number of available gong farmers would increase proportionally. Society had found a way to literally dispose of its most desperate members while solving a sanitation problem. 2 birds, 1 stone, countless human lives. Now let me tell you about the ones who didn't make it home, because the medieval records, buried in monastery archives and city ledgers, tell stories that would make horror writers weep with envy, except these aren't fiction. These are death certificates written in Latin by clerks who treated human mortality like accounting entries. Take Richard the Raker, documented in the London City Records of 1326. The official cause of death, misadventure while performing civic duty. The reality? Richard suffocated in a cesspit, while his partner, William the gong farmer, watched helplessly from above. But here's the part that will chill your soul. William didn't call for help immediately. He waited. He waited because he knew that if authorities investigated, they'd probably force him to go down and retrieve the body. And that would likely mean joining Richard in death. The records show that Richard's body wasn't recovered for 3 days. When they finally hauled him up, the corpse had swollen to twice its normal size from gas buildup. The toxic environment had accelerated decomposition so dramatically that Richard's own wife couldn't identify him by his face. They had to use his distinctive hand scars, ironic identification marks earned from previous cesspit work, to confirm his identity. The city paid his widow 3 shillings for her loss and immediately began recruiting his replacement. But Richard was one of the lucky ones. At least his death was recorded. Most gong farmer deaths never made it into official records because their bodies were never found. They'd simply disappear into the toxic soup of human waste and centuries of accumulated filth. Some pits were so deep, so treacherous, that they became mass graves without anyone officially acknowledging it. The Canterbury Cathedral archives contain a letter from 1342 that reads like a medieval horror story. Brother Augustine writes about a cesspit beneath the monastery's guest quarters that had claimed 5 gong farmers in 2 years. He describes the pit as a mouth to hell that devours good Christian men and spits back naught but bones and corruption. The monks eventually sealed the pit permanently rather than continue losing workers, choosing to build new facilities elsewhere rather than face the mounting death toll. What's particularly disturbing is how these deaths were categorized. Medieval authorities developed an entire taxonomy of cesspit deaths that reveals their cold calculation of human loss. Deaths from evil vapors were considered acts of God, no compensation required. Deaths from misadventure qualified for minimal widow's payments. Deaths from negligence, meaning the worker had supposedly failed to follow proper procedures that didn't actually exist, voided any claim to assistance. The most cynical category was death by folly, reserved for gong farmers who died trying to save their coworkers. The logic was beautifully twisted. If you were stupid enough to risk your life for another person, your death didn't deserve compensation because you'd brought it on yourself. This effectively discouraged any form of workplace solidarity or mutual aid, ensuring that gong farmers remained isolated and expendable. Let me paint you a picture of what proper procedure actually looked like, based on surviving guild regulations from other cities. In Paris, the rules required gong farmers to work in teams of 3, not for safety, but to ensure witnesses in case of theft accusations. They were required to work only between sunset and sunrise, carrying lanterns that created fire hazards in methane-rich environments. They had to remove all waste to designated areas outside the city walls, hauling cartloads of toxic sludge through darkened streets while breathing poison with every step. The carts themselves were death traps. Wooden wheels would rot from constant exposure to acidic waste. Axles would corrode and snap, sending tons of fermenting excrement cascading onto whoever was nearby. The horses used for these carts had lifespans measured in months. The constant exposure to toxic fumes would blind them, burn their respiratory systems, and eventually kill them just as surely as it killed their human handlers. But perhaps the most horrifying recorded case comes from the York City archives, dating to 1357. A gong farmer named Edmund had been working a particularly deep cesspit for 3 days when he discovered something that nearly drove him mad: human bones. Not just any bones, the distinctive remains of his predecessor, a man named Thomas, who had disappeared 6 months earlier while cleaning the same pit. The records show that Edmund tried to retrieve Thomas's remains for proper burial, and in doing so, fell into the same toxic soup that had claimed his colleague. The truly nightmarish part? Edmund survived. He was pulled out after nearly drowning in liquid human waste, his lungs seared by hydrogen sulfide, his skin chemically burned from exposure to concentrated acids. But the experience had destroyed his mind. The city records describe him as touched by devils after his rescue, unable to speak coherently, refusing to come indoors, spending his remaining days, all 3 weeks of them, crouched in corners, frantically washing his hands with sand and ashes. When Edmund died, the city authorities made a chilling decision. They declared the pit a cursed ground and sealed it permanently. Not out of respect for the dead or concern for future workers, but because the stories of its victims were beginning to frighten potential replacements. They couldn't afford to let worker superstitions interfere with essential city services. The medical understanding of cesspit deaths reveals another layer of medieval horror. Monastery infirmaries kept detailed records of gong farmer injuries and illnesses because they were required to provide charity care to anyone who could make it to their doors. These records read like catalogs of chemical warfare casualties. Monks documented cases of black lung. What we now know was severe chemical pneumonia from inhaling hydrogen sulfide. They treated gong farmers' shakes, neurological damage from chronic toxin exposure. They recorded cases of waist blindness, corneal scarring from acid splash exposure. What's most chilling is how these conditions were treated. Medieval medicine blamed corrupted humors and prescribed bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies that often made the poisoning worse. Gong farmers who sought treatment were sometimes subjected to mercury poisoning as a cure for their existing chemical poisoning. The treatment protocols were so dangerous that many poisoned workers chose to die at home rather than seek medical help. The social isolation of gong farmers extended even to their deaths. They couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, not because of religious doctrine, but because parish priests claimed their corpses were too contaminated to rest beside decent Christians. Special burial grounds were established outside city walls, usually in marshy areas where the ground was too poor for agriculture. These graveyards became known as gong fields, and their soil was so saturated with toxins that nothing would grow there for decades. Even their families couldn't escape the stigma of toxic death. Widows of gong farmers were barred from remarrying within church walls. They had to settle for civil ceremonies if they could find anyone willing to marry into a contaminated bloodline. Children were expelled from schools, refused apprenticeships, and generally treated as carriers of whatever curse had claimed their fathers. But here's where the story takes a truly sinister turn. Some authorities began deliberately recruiting from specific populations. Cities would target immigrants, debtors, and religious minorities for cesspit work, using it as a form of slow-motion execution disguised as employment. The records show suspicious patterns. Jewish families forced into gong farming after being barred from other trades. Irish immigrants steered toward cesspit work within days of arriving in English cities. Debtors offered cesspit work as an alternative to prison, knowing full well it was essentially a death sentence with extra steps. The most documented case comes from London's Jewish community in the 1280s. After being barred from most professions and facing increasing persecution, many Jewish families were forced into cesspit work. The death rate was so high that within a generation, entire family lines had been wiped out. This wasn't accidental. It was systematic elimination disguised as economic necessity. What makes this even more horrifying is that the authorities kept meticulous records of these demographic patterns. They knew exactly which populations they were destroying and at what rate. They calculated replacement rates, tracked family survival statistics, and adjusted recruitment strategies based on death tolls. It was genocide by sanitation management, hidden in plain sight within city planning documents. The psychological toll on survivors was documented by monastery confessors, who heard the final words of dying gong farmers. These men didn't just fear death, they feared being forgotten, erased from history like they'd never existed. Many spent their final moments not praying for salvation, but desperately trying to ensure someone would remember their names, their families, their humanity. The confessors' records preserve these whispered pleas for remembrance, final protests against systematic erasure. But perhaps the most chilling detail in these death records is what they don't contain: expressions of surprise. Medieval authorities expected gong farmers to die horribly and regularly. They budgeted for replacement costs, scheduled recruitment drives, and factored cesspit deaths into their urban planning with the same casual efficiency they used for calculating grain supplies or tax revenues. Human death had become a municipal resource, managed and allocated like any other city expense. Now let me tell you about the ones who tried to escape. Because if you think the job itself was horrifying, wait until you hear what happened to gong farmers who attempted to abandon their trade. Medieval society had constructed an invisible prison around these men, and the walls weren't made of stone. They were made of law, custom, and systematic cruelty that ensured once you entered the world of cesspit cleaning, your only exit was death. The legal framework was elegantly vicious. Most cities had ordinances requiring gong farmers to complete contracted work before seeking other employment. Sounds reasonable, right? Except these contracts were deliberately designed to be uncompletable. They'd require a single worker to clean more pits than could physically be managed in the allotted time. Or they'd specify impossible standards of cleanliness that could never be achieved in toxic environments. Breaking these contracts meant imprisonment for breach of civic duty, and medieval prisons were often deadlier than the cesspits themselves. Take the case of Walter the Gong Farmer from Norwich, documented in the city records of 1334. After 3 years of cesspit work had left him partially blind and suffering from what monks described as the shaking sickness, Walter attempted to flee to London, where he hoped to find work as a common laborer. He made it exactly 12 miles before being arrested by the city's bailiffs. The charge? Theft of municipal property. The property in question? His own specialized knowledge of Norwich's cesspit system. The authorities claimed that Walter's expertise belonged to the city that had trained him, and abandoning his post constituted theft of civic resources. He was sentenced to return to cesspit work for an additional 2 years to compensate the city for the cost of finding and training his replacement. Walter died 4 months after his forced return, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated toxins that the legal system had prevented him from escaping. But the law was just one layer of the trap. Social stigma created an even more effective prison. Gong farmers developed what we might now recognize as a distinctive occupational signature, physical and behavioral markers that made them instantly identifiable to anyone who knew what to look for. The grayish skin tone from chronic chemical exposure couldn't be hidden with cosmetics that didn't exist. The distinctive gait caused by nerve damage was impossible to disguise. The smell penetrated so deeply into their bodies that months of bathing couldn't eliminate it. Even if a gong farmer somehow managed to escape his contracts and flee to another city, these markers would betray him within days. Innkeepers would refuse him service. Potential employers would turn him away before he could speak. Other workers would refuse to share quarters with him. He'd be forced back into the only profession that would accept him, usually under even worse conditions than before, because his desperation would be obvious to everyone. The guild system created another layer of entrapment. While gong farmers were excluded from forming their own guilds, other trades were legally prohibited from accepting anyone with a history of cesspit work. The reasoning was supposedly about contamination, the fear that someone who'd worked with human waste would pollute whatever trade they entered. But the real purpose was maintaining a captive workforce for the most dangerous job in medieval society. Master craftsmen who violated these prohibitions faced severe penalties. In 1341, a London blacksmith named Geoffrey was stripped of his guild membership and fined heavily for apprenticing the son of a deceased gong farmer. The boy, barely 14 and desperate to escape his father's fate, had shown exceptional skill with metalwork, but the guild ruled that the corruption of the father flows through the blood of the son and ordered the boy returned to cesspit work. He died before his 16th birthday, asphyxiated in the same pit that had claimed his father. The church provided another mechanism for trapping gong farmers in their deadly profession. Confession records from the period reveal a systematic pattern of spiritual coercion. Priests would tell gong farmers that their work was God's punishment for sins, either their own or their ancestors. Attempting to escape this divine judgment through changing professions was presented as a form of heresy, a rejection of God's will that would damn their souls eternally. What's particularly insidious is how this spiritual manipulation was tailored to each individual's desperation. A gong farmer worried about his family's future would be told that his suffering was necessary to purify his bloodline for future generations. One struggling with the physical agony of his work would be assured that his pain was washing away sins that would otherwise condemn him to hell. The church had weaponized hope itself, turning it into another chain binding these men to their lethal trade. Some tried to escape through marriage, hoping that wedding into families outside the cesspit trade might provide protection and new opportunities. These attempts usually ended in tragedy. The marriage records from Lincoln Cathedral tell the story of Agnes, daughter of a cloth merchant, who secretly married Robert the Gong Farmer in 1329. When her family discovered the union, they didn't just disown her, they petitioned the church to annul the marriage on grounds of concealed contamination. The annulment was granted, but Agnes refused to abandon her husband. She was declared legally dead by her family and expelled from her father's house. With no skills and no family support, she was forced to assist Robert in his cesspit work, the only employment available to them. She lasted 8 months before dying of what the records describe as corruption of the lungs. Robert survived her by 3 weeks before joining her in the gong fields outside the city walls. The most desperate escape attempts involved geographic flight, trying to reach territories where the local authorities might not recognize or care about their occupational history. Some attempted to join monasteries, hoping that religious vows might provide sanctuary from secular persecution. Others tried to sign on as soldiers in foreign wars, gambling that military service might offer either death with honor or a chance to reinvent themselves far from home. These attempts almost always failed, and for a chilling reason. Medieval Europe had developed an informal information network specifically designed to track and recapture escaped gong farmers. City authorities would send descriptions of fugitives to neighboring jurisdictions, complete with details about their physical condition and occupational markers. Monasteries would refuse admission to anyone bearing the telltale signs of cesspit work. Military recruiters were instructed to reject applicants with the characteristic nerve damage and respiratory problems of experienced gong farmers. The network was so effective that some cities began offering bounties for information leading to the capture of escaped cesspit workers. These bounties were modest, usually just a few coins, but they created an economic incentive for ordinary citizens to become informants. Innkeepers, merchants, even beggars could earn money by identifying and reporting former gong farmers trying to blend into new communities. What's most horrifying is that this tracking system was justified as public health policy. Authorities claimed they were protecting their populations from contamination, preventing the spread of diseases that gong farmers supposedly carried. But the real motivation was economic. Cities had invested resources in identifying and training these workers, and they weren't about to let their investment walk away, even if that investment was literally killing the people involved. The few who managed successful escapes did so through methods so extreme they reveal the desperation of their situation. Some deliberately injured themselves, breaking bones, damaging eyes, or even amputating fingers, to create disabilities that would make cesspit work impossible, while providing plausible alternative explanations for their unemployability. Others would commit minor crimes that would result in imprisonment or exile, gambling that any alternative fate would be preferable to returning to the pits. The most successful escape route, grotesquely, was leprosy. The handful of gong farmers who contracted this disease found themselves expelled from their profession and their communities, but also freed from the legal and social chains that bound them to cesspit work. Leper colonies, while horrific by modern standards, offered something that mainstream medieval society denied these men: the possibility of living without daily exposure to lethal toxins. Some evidence suggests that certain gong farmers deliberately exposed themselves to lepers, choosing a slow death from disease over the faster death awaiting them in the cesspits. But even successful escapes came with a terrible cost: the knowledge that someone else would have to take their place. Every gong farmer who fled created a vacancy that would be filled by another desperate soul. Some who managed to break free were eventually driven back to cesspit work by guilt over their replacement's fates. They couldn't live with the knowledge that their freedom had been purchased with another man's death sentence. The authorities understood this psychology and exploited it ruthlessly. When they captured escaped gong farmers, they'd often force them to watch the recruitment of their replacements, usually younger men or the sons of their former colleagues. The message was clear: your attempted escape has condemned another to die in your place. This psychological torture was often more effective than legal penalties in breaking the will of would-be escapees. Perhaps most chilling of all were the mercy provisions that some cities developed for long-term gong farmers. After a certain period of service, usually measured in years, survived rather than work completed, experienced cesspit cleaners would be offered retirement to less dangerous civic duties: street sweeping, waste cart maintenance, public latrine supervision, jobs that were still degrading and dangerous but didn't require daily descents into toxic death traps. The cruel irony? Most gong farmers who reached this stage were already too damaged by their years of chemical exposure to benefit from these supposed mercies. Their nervous systems were shot, their lungs were scarred beyond repair, their bodies were riddled with cancers and organ damage that medieval medicine couldn't understand, let alone treat. The retirement was often just a chance to die more slowly in slightly less toxic conditions, while training the next generation of victims. And that brings us to the most heartbreaking chapter in this catalog of medieval horror: the children. Because the system didn't just destroy individual men, it devoured entire bloodlines, generation after generation, creating hereditary chains of suffering that stretched across centuries. The children of gong farmers weren't just born into poverty. They were born into a genetic lottery where the prize was always death, and the only variable was how quickly it would come. Picture little Thomas, son of Robert the Gong Farmer, documented in the Winchester records of 1345, 7 years old, already bearing the telltale signs of chronic malnutrition because his father's wages barely covered rent for their hovel near the city's waste pits. But malnutrition was the least of his problems. Thomas was breathing secondhand death every day of his young life. His father would return home each night carrying invisible clouds of hydrogen, sulfide, methane, and acids that would settle into the family's living space like a toxic fog. The medieval medical records from monastery infirmaries reveal something that will make your skin crawl. Children of gong farmers developed respiratory problems, skin conditions, and neurological symptoms that mimicked their father's occupational diseases, even when they'd never set foot near a cesspit. The toxins weren't just killing the workers, they were poisoning their families through secondary exposure, creating a widening circle of contamination that trapped entire households in slow-motion death. But the physical inheritance was just the beginning. Medieval society had constructed an elaborate system to ensure that the children of gong farmers would have no choice but to follow in their father's footsteps. It started with education, or rather, the deliberate denial of it. Schools, usually run by religious orders, would refuse admission to children from contaminated families. The official reasoning was protecting other students from moral and physical corruption, but the real purpose was maintaining a steady supply of future cesspit workers. The few children who did receive any education faced a curriculum specifically designed to prepare them for their predetermined fate. Instead of learning to read Latin or basic mathematics, they were taught about divine providence and accepting God's plan. They learned songs about finding dignity in humble service and stories about saints who found salvation through suffering. Their education was essentially psychological conditioning, designed to make them accept their inherited death sentence as a form of spiritual calling. What's most disturbing is how the system turned parents into unwilling accomplices in their children's destruction. Gong farmers were required to train their own sons in the trade, usually beginning around age 12. This wasn't optional. City ordinances mandated that cesspit workers pass their knowledge to the next generation, and failure to comply would result in loss of employment and imprisonment for breach of civic duty. Imagine the psychological torture of teaching your own child how to die, because that's what this training really was. A father passing on the techniques that would eventually kill his son, while both of them pretended it was about providing for the family. The training manuals that survive in monastery archives read like suicide instructions disguised as vocational guidance. Breathe shallow when descending. Test air quality with flame before entering. Work quickly to minimize exposure. Every lesson was a compromise with death, a negotiation about how long the child might survive before the inevitable. The age at which boys entered active cesspit work varied by region, but the Winchester records show children as young as 10 working alongside their fathers in the toxic pits. 10 years old, carrying wooden scoops bigger than themselves, breathing poison that would scar their developing lungs and nervous systems. Their small size was actually considered advantageous for certain types of cesspit work. They could fit into spaces too cramped for adult workers, making them valuable for the most dangerous cleaning jobs. But the system's cruelty didn't stop with the sons. Daughters of gong farmers faced a different but equally horrific fate. Since they couldn't inherit their father's trade directly, they were funneled into related occupations that exposed them to similar health hazards. They became washerwomen specializing in cleaning the clothing and equipment of cesspit workers, a job that involved constant exposure to the same toxic substances that killed their male relatives. They worked as assistants in public latrines, as cleaners in the waste processing areas outside city walls, as handlers of the contaminated materials that no one else would touch. The marriage prospects for these girls were a special kind of nightmare. The only men willing to marry daughters of gong farmers were usually gong farmers themselves, creating closed loops of contamination and despair. Wedding records from the period show disturbing patterns. Girls married at younger and younger ages as families desperately tried to secure their futures before their occupational stigma became too obvious. These weren't marriages. They were transactions designed to maintain the workforce needed for society's most dangerous job. The children who showed exceptional intelligence or talent faced particularly cruel fates. Instead of being allowed to escape their predetermined roles, they were often selected for specialized training that made them more valuable and more trapped within the cesspit industry. Bright boys might be taught to read and write so they could maintain work records and inventory toxic materials. Clever girls might learn basic mathematics to calculate wages and manage household finances for cesspit worker families. Their talents became tools for their own oppression, used to make the system of hereditary death sentences more efficient. What's most chilling is how the system adapted to prevent even the most exceptional children from escaping. When authorities noticed that some gong farmer children were demonstrating unusual abilities, artistic talent, mathematical skills, exceptional memory, they developed specific interventions to redirect these gifts toward occupational purposes. A boy with steady hands might be trained to handle the most delicate cesspit equipment. A girl with a good memory might be tasked with maintaining oral histories of pit locations and hazard patterns. The few children who managed to demonstrate abilities that couldn't be redirected faced systematic sabotage. Their work would be criticized as inadequate regardless of its quality. Their teachers would find reasons to expel them from any educational opportunities. Their potential employers would receive visits from city officials warning about the dangers of hiring from contaminated bloodlines. The system had immune responses designed to identify and destroy anything that threatened its supply of expendable workers. The psychological damage inflicted on these children was documented by monastery confessors who heard their final words. Many died expressing not fear of death, but terror of having disappointed their families by failing to live up to their inherited obligations. They'd been so thoroughly conditioned to see themselves as inherently suited only for toxic work that they interpreted their own deaths as personal failures rather than systematic murder. Perhaps most horrifying were the apprenticeship ceremonies that some cities developed for children entering cesspit work. These weren't just practical training sessions, they were ritual initiations designed to psychologically bind children to their deadly profession. The ceremonies would take place in decorated chambers above the very cesspits where the children would eventually die, with city officials and family members gathered to witness the child's dedication to civic service. The children would swear oaths, pledging their lives to maintaining the city's sanitation systems. They'd receive ceremonial tools, child-sized scoops and buckets that were actually functional equipment for their future work. Most disturbing of all, they'd be required to descend partway into a cesspit as part of the ceremony, breathing their first lungfuls of the poison that would define and end their lives. The ceremony would conclude with the child being declared wed to the city's service, language deliberately chosen to emphasize that this was a permanent, indissoluble bond. Parents were required to attend and express pride in their children's dedication, creating a public spectacle that made retreat psychologically impossible. The children were trapped not just by legal and economic forces, but by the public shame that would fall on their families if they tried to back out of their inherited obligations. But the system's cruelest innovation was the creation of cesspit orphanages, institutions that took in children whose parents had died in cesspit work and specifically prepared them to continue the family tradition. These weren't charitable institutions in any meaningful sense. They were breeding programs designed to maintain a steady supply of workers willing to accept deadly conditions as normal. The children in these orphanages were fed just enough to survive, housed in conditions that made cesspit work seem like improvement, and subjected to educational programs that glorified their future profession while systematically destroying any sense of self-worth that might lead them to seek alternatives. They were taught that their parents had died heroically in service to their communities, and that following in their footsteps was the only way to honor their memory. The most successful graduates of these orphanages were those who displayed what the records describe as appropriate resignation, children who had been so thoroughly broken that they approached their deadly inheritance with calm acceptance rather than fear or rebellion. These children were held up as examples to others, rewarded with slightly better treatment and the privilege of training younger orphans in the same psychological techniques that had destroyed their own hopes for survival. The system even created hierarchies among the doomed children, giving some the illusion of advancement and control while ensuring that none could actually escape their fate. The most compliant orphans might be designated as senior apprentices, with responsibility for training newcomers. The most physically capable might be assigned to special projects that offered marginally better working conditions. But these distinctions were purely cosmetic. Every child in the system was still destined for the same toxic death, just with slightly different timing and circumstances. But here's what will keep you awake tonight. This system didn't just disappear with the medieval period. It evolved. It adapted. It learned to hide itself in plain sight, wearing the masks of progress and civilization while continuing to feed human lives into the machinery of societal convenience. The cesspit cleaners are gone, but the logic that created them, the calculation that some human lives are acceptable losses for the comfort of others, that logic never died. It just got better at disguising itself. Let me show you how the medieval cesspit system blueprint became the foundation for centuries of systematic human disposal. The Industrial Revolution didn't eliminate the gong farmer model. It perfected it. Factory owners looked at medieval records and saw something beautiful, a proven method for maintaining dangerous but essential work through expendable populations who could be systematically replaced as they died. The coal mines, the textile mills, the chemical plants, they all adopted variations of the cesspit recruitment and retention strategies that had kept medieval toilets clean and medieval consciences clear. The match girls of Victorian London, dying from phosphorus poisoning while making the matches that lit middle-class drawing rooms. The radium girls of the early 20th century, painting watch dials with radioactive paint they were told to lick to maintain fine brush points. The asbestos workers who built the fireproof buildings, where their bosses held board meetings about acceptable death rates. Every single one of these industries studied the medieval cesspit system and thought, yes, this is how you maintain essential but deadly work. You make sure the workers have no other options. What's most chilling is how the psychological conditioning techniques pioneered on Gong farmer children became standard practice across industries, the company towns that isolated workers from outside opportunities, the specialized schools that trained children for specific industrial jobs while limiting their educational horizons, the hierarchical systems that gave some workers supervisory roles over others, creating the illusion of advancement within fundamentally exploitative structures. Medieval cesspit management had become corporate human resources policy. Even today, right now, as you sit comfortably consuming this content, the cesspit system is operating around you. Who cleans up nuclear waste at decommissioned power plants? Who handles the most toxic chemicals in manufacturing processes? Who works in conditions so dangerous that the companies involved have calculated insurance payouts for worker deaths as routine business expenses? The faces have changed, the technology has improved, but the fundamental logic remains identical. Society identifies essential but deadly work and ensures that only the most desperate people have to do it. The documentation of medieval Gong farmer deaths wasn't just record-keeping. It was research and development for future systems of expendable labor. Corporate archives from the 19th and 20th centuries contain explicit references to medieval precedents for managing high mortality occupations. They studied the recruitment strategies, the legal frameworks for trapping workers, the methods for preventing organization and resistance. Medieval city planners had written the definitive manual for systematic human disposal, and their successors have been following it ever since. But the most horrifying continuity lies in how society trains itself not to see what's happening. Medieval citizens weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who had learned to compartmentalize the suffering required to maintain their comfort. They developed elaborate mental frameworks for explaining why Gong farmer deaths were natural, necessary, even noble. The religious justifications, the economic rationalizations, the cultural narratives that transformed systematic murder into heroic service, these weren't medieval peculiarities. They were prototypes for the psychological mechanisms that modern society uses to ignore its own expendable workers. Think about how we talk about essential workers during crises. The language is identical to medieval descriptions of Gong farmers. Vital to society, deserving of respect and gratitude, but somehow never deserving of the resources that would actually protect their lives. We've learned to honor people with words while ensuring through policy that their jobs remain deadly and their alternatives remain limited. The applause for healthcare workers during the pandemic while denying them adequate protective equipment? That's pure Gong farmer logic. Praise the sacrifice while maintaining the conditions that require it. The most disturbing parallel involves children. Medieval society created elaborate justifications for why some children needed to inherit deadly occupations: family tradition, economic necessity, natural aptitude for dangerous work. Modern society does exactly the same thing, just with better public relations. We talk about generational poverty and limited opportunities, as if they're natural disasters rather than policy choices. We create educational systems that funnel children from specific communities toward dangerous occupations, while calling it vocational training and practical skills development. The geographic patterns are identical too. Medieval cities concentrated their most toxic industries in specific districts, usually near water sources, so waste could be easily disposed of downstream from wealthy neighborhoods. Modern cities follow the same blueprint: chemical plants, waste processing facilities, and heavy manufacturing concentrated in communities with the least political power. The medieval Gong fields where poisoned workers were buried have become modern sacrifice zones, where entire populations are exposed to industrial toxins so the rest of society can enjoy clean air and water. What's most chilling is how the system has learned to use its own history as camouflage. We're taught to look back at medieval cesspit cleaners as evidence of how far we've come, how much more civilized we've become. But this historical narrative serves the same function as medieval religious justifications. It makes us feel better about current systems of expendable labor by convincing us they're either temporary or necessary steps toward progress. The truth is that every major technological advancement has been accompanied by new forms of systematically dangerous work performed by expendable populations. Nuclear power created new categories of radiation workers whose health effects are monitored and documented with the same clinical detachment that medieval monks used to record Gong farmer deaths. Computer manufacturing depends on workers in countries with minimal safety regulations, handling toxic chemicals that cause the same kinds of neurological damage that hydrogen sulfide inflicted on medieval cesspit cleaners. Even the internet you're using right now depends on systems that follow the medieval cesspit model. Who mines the rare earth elements for your devices? Who handles the electronic waste when you upgrade? Who works in the server farms that power your streaming services, often in buildings where industrial accidents and chemical exposures are classified as trade secrets? The technology changes, but the human cost calculation remains identical. Identify essential but dangerous work and ensure it's performed by people with no other choices. The documentation strategies have also evolved in disturbing ways. Medieval authorities kept detailed records of gong farmer deaths because they needed the information for replacement planning and cost accounting. Modern corporations and governments maintain similar databases, but they've learned to classify them in ways that prevent public scrutiny. Occupational health statistics, industrial accident reports, and environmental health studies serve the same function as medieval death records. They track the human cost of essential systems while maintaining the political and economic structures that require that cost. What's most terrifying is how the system has learned to make itself invisible through complexity. Medieval cesspit cleaning was obviously dangerous and clearly linked to specific deaths. Modern equivalents are often spread across multiple companies, countries, and decades, making the causal relationships harder to trace but no less real. The worker who dies from cancer caused by chemical exposure 20 years ago is just as dead as the gong farmer who suffocated in methane gas, but the diffused timeline makes it easier for society to ignore the connection. The psychological conditioning has become more sophisticated too. Instead of explicit religious justifications for why some people must do deadly work, we have economic and technological narratives that serve the same function. We're told that automation will eventually eliminate dangerous jobs, so current worker deaths are unfortunate but temporary. We're assured that safety regulations are constantly improving, so worker deaths represent isolated failures rather than systemic features. These narratives serve the same psychological function as medieval religious explanations. They allow society to feel progressive and moral while maintaining systems that require human sacrifice. But perhaps the most chilling continuity involves the children. Medieval society explicitly trained gong farmer children for deadly occupations through specialized education and apprenticeship programs. Modern society does the same thing, but with better public relations. We call it career and technical education or workforce development, but the function is identical. Identifying children from specific communities and preparing them for occupations that society needs, but that carry significantly higher mortality risks than other options. The tracking systems have also become more sophisticated. Medieval authorities physically marked gong farmers with occupational signatures that made escape difficult. Modern systems use credit scores, criminal records, educational credentials, and geographic isolation to achieve the same result, ensuring that people designated for dangerous work have limited alternatives and can be easily identified if they try to escape their assigned roles. So when you flush your toilet tonight, when you turn on your lights, when you check your phone, remember the gong farmers. Remember that someone, somewhere, is paying the price for your convenience with their health, their future, their life. The cesspits are gone, but the logic that filled them with human corpses is still operating all around you. It's just learned to hide better, to use different words, to spread the deaths across enough time and space that you don't have to see the connections. The medieval chroniclers who documented gong farmer deaths thought they were recording history. They had no idea they were writing the instruction manual for the modern world. And the most terrifying part? We're still following their blueprint, still sacrificing lives for convenience, still finding ways to sleep peacefully while other people die for our comfort. The only thing that's changed is our ability to lie to ourselves about what we're doing. We've become very, very good at not seeing the cesspits. But they're still there, and they're still claiming victims, and somewhere in the dark, another desperate soul is climbing down a ladder into poison, hoping to survive just one more day in hell.